afternoon, everybody. Wow, power. So, can everyone hear me okay? Or do I have to? All right, okay. So, I've got the tall shoes on today, so I'm all the farther away from the microphone. Thank you so much for coming to what is our 6th annual Are You a Bookie event. We really appreciate this. We're always up against, as you are with any event, always up against something, be it acts of nature or acts of relatives or communions or weddings and whatever. So we appreciate you taking the time in this beautiful weather to come here and listen to our fabulous panel of authors today and to get more ideas for the next books that you and your book clubs might read. We welcome both book clubs and individual readers here to this event, and it's an opportunity for you to learn a little bit perhaps about what went into a story before it even became a story, how the book was written, a little bit, perhaps you might hear a few excerpts, and then we'll have a question and answer period after everyone has spoken. And then you'll have a chance to have your books signed if you like. Sarah is over there with a wonderful selection of books. We also have some bookmarks, I believe. I know we have Hattie bookmarks. And take the opportunity also to speak to the authors about perhaps speaking to your book club, maybe visiting your book club in this wonderful new age of all kinds of newfangled stuff. They can Skype with you perhaps, call you on the phone. I've had the great experience of being on the phone with book clubs in the Midwest and out on the West Coast, and they're all whooping it up, and I'm in my pajamas on my couch talking with them. So, we want you to read our books. We're excited when you do, and we're really thrilled to be part of the discussion process too, so take that opportunity. And I'm welcoming back, I know we have a lot of veteran Are You a Bookie participants here today too. We really appreciate that. Marnie didn't bring her My Book Club Can Beat Up Your Book Club t-shirt today, but she has in the past. And I also have participants here from my Wednesday night writing workshop that just concluded in the past Wednesday. So thank you for coming. There's no extra credit because it's over, but you came anyways. So I always love to start out any kind of literary event by thanking whoever shows up, because no you, no us. We don't get to do what we do unless no one reads it. So if no one's reading, we don't get to do this for a living, and a lot of us do this for a living. So we are very, very grateful, and thank you again for being here. The idea of this day came about via Vice President at BayPath, Karen Hoban, and it was originally aimed at book clubs as a way to connect local book clubs with authors, and over the years it has come to include folks that just like to read. They wander in and get to know perhaps new books and people that they have perhaps not read before. I'm Suzanne Strumpik-Shea, and my job is writer in residence here at BayPath. My duties include helping plan a variety of literary events here, along with working with the fabulous Brianna Sittler, who was wandering. I don't see her now. There she is, yay. She is the director of special programs, a special program like this. And among our fun work is we put on 2 writers' days each year. In October and February, we have a slate of lectures on topics related to writing and publishing. We arrange visiting writers and artists to spend a week on campus twice a year. And in October, we're going to have Nuala Nikonker, who is a really, really highly acclaimed short story writer from Ireland, is going to come here and spend a week working with the students here and also doing some public programs, so be on the lookout for that. My favorite part of this work that I do with Brianna is inviting writers to these various events. And in the literary haven that is New England, that's really like gliding through a box of fine chocolates. It's so many greats to choose from, so many you might have not sampled before, so many new to the collection. So that's what we're lucky enough to have here today in veteran and best-selling author and columnist Joan Wickersham, and 3 newly published authors, Cal Armistead, David Bergengren, and Anna Bozena Bowen. After Joan's talk, we'll hear from the other 3 authors, then we'll have a question and answer session. After that, the authors will be free to talk with anyone who wishes and to sign copies of their books. Talk with writers individually. As I said, invite them to groups, and if you haven't yet shopped, please feel free. I always like to say the holidays will be here before you know it, so whatever holiday you personally celebrate. So to begin, We are delighted, and I am delighted to have Joan Wickersham give our main talk of this afternoon. I'm super delighted personally, having been a fan of hers since reading her 1995 novel, The Paper Anniversary, early in my own writing career, and getting to find out that she is as lovely in person as she is talented on the page. I've become even more of a flag waver for her as I've come to know her work across the board of a few genres. My Wednesday night group will know that I'm always talking about seeing an author stretch and having those different wheels turning in the head. How many genres can you cover? What new can you try to do? And Joan does that and is a great example of creating work that falls into more than a few categories, be that fiction, nonfiction, and commentary. Her work includes a 2008 memoir, The Suicide Index, Putting My Father's Death in Order, which was a National Book Award finalist, a huge thing, as well as appearing on Best Books of the Year lists, including those by the Boston Globe, the LA Times, New York Magazine, and the Washington Post. She is also the author of a gorgeous new short story collection, The News from Spain, 7 Variations on a Love Story, of which Tom Barbash, reviewing it in the New York Times earlier this year, said, "Wickersham's gift is for capturing the habits of mind that lead even smart people to deceive themselves, make poor choices, slide into affairs or marriages that have little chance of succeeding. As much as love, her characters long for affirmation, eager as they are to see themselves in another's eyes as desirable and desired." So it makes you want to open that up. And you'll find that Spain, or something Spanish related, is a connection for the collection in which no story actually takes place there. So for the writers among us too, it would be kind of a fun assignment, connect your stories with that one element, but not have it be there. So I was fascinated by that too. Though fiction, these stories really feature the author's trademark radar for what makes us human, vulnerable, messy, and wonderful, sometimes all at the same time. Whether featuring Mozart in his studio or the widow of a race car driver, the pieces showcase her ability for making even the invented character so real that we walk away wishing we could give them a call to check in on how everything is going now. Joan regularly writes an op-ed column for the Boston Globe in which she looks at culture, relationships, language, the events of every day. And she has contributed on-air essays. You might have heard her on NPR shows On Point, which I love, and Morning Edition. She has been awarded fellowships by the National Endowments for the Arts, another huge deal, the Massachusetts Cultural Council, the MacDowell Colony, and my group might know about that as well, and Yaddo. Her work has been championed by book clubs all over the country, and I hope you'll add one or more of her titles to your list for the coming season. Let's welcome, all the way from Cambridge, Joan Wickersham.
Well, Suzanne, thank you for that gorgeous introduction, which was also a gorgeous talk about books, which is why we're all here today. And thank you to Brianna also for organizing this event and for having me here, and to the other writers who I'm excited to read, and to all of you for being here. It's so exciting to be at an event that is just, everyone is here for one reason, which is that we all love to read. And I actually wanted to start, you talked about stretching into different genres. I'm going to stretch myself today into the genre of PowerPoint, where I have never been before. But I wanted to start this talk. I don't know if we can make the lights sort of dimmer so that the images on screen will be clearer. Great. Ah, it works. I wanted to start by talking about, I just got back 2 days ago from a trip to Scandinavia. I went to, my husband Jay and I went to Copenhagen for a week, and then we spent a week in Stockholm. And Jay was trained as an architect, and so whenever we travel, we spend quite a bit of time walking around the city and looking at buildings. And one of the buildings that Jay particularly wanted to see in Stockholm was the Stockholm Public Library, which was designed by an architect named Gunnar Asplund, and it was completed in 1928. And so when I go with Jay on these trips, I sort of tag along to these buildings, and I'm sort of interested, but I'm sort of humoring him. It's just what we do when we travel. And so I sort of thought, okay, well, I'll go with you to the Stockholm Public Library. So we go to the Stockholm Public Library, and there it is, and it's a I think it's a handsome building so far, so okay, you know. And then we walk up the steps and we go inside, and you come in and you're in this dark little entryway, and you walk up that staircase. And when I got up to the top of the stairs, I looked around and I realized I was starting to cry. And I'll show you why, and I know that everyone in this room, this event is called Why, you know, Are You a Bookie? This is what made me start to cry. I mean, it was just astonishing. I wish I understood dimensions better, but I would say that the size of this room was a circle, it was a cylinder, and it was at least as the diameter of the cylinder was at least from this wall to that wall, and possibly even a little more. And it was just completely lined with books. And utterly, this doesn't do justice to the glowingness of the books. It was, I've never been in a space that was more excited about or more reverent about books in my life. And I couldn't believe it. The whole building is just this cylinder, three tiers high and completely lined with books. So anyway, that's my idea of heaven, and I'm sure that's true of everyone here, just wall to wall to wall to wall books. And I think I tried to figure out what exactly is it that's so moving about this. And I think some of it is, you know, as Suzanne said in her introduction when she said, you know, it's just, reading feels almost endangered these days. The book as a physical object certainly feels endangered. I get so mad whenever I read, you know, an op-ed piece that talks about the book is dead, you know, and people are reading electronic books and everything. And I sort of feel like, you know, you can argue about format, whatever, but I feel like literature is alive. And I personally love the book as a physical object. This place was like a temple to the book as a physical object. But also, I felt as if seeing all these books together and thinking ahead to this event, I was thinking about how, as a reader, I have my own pantheon of books. I have the books that I've been reading, you know, since I was a kid. I have a kind of temple in my head that's my collection of all the books I've read in a lifetime. And I know that everyone here probably has the same thing. And I felt like this building, more than any place I've ever been, embodied that experience of you read one book at a time, but you put them all together in your head, and you have this kind of collective temple of books. This was really a temple of books, and I just found that thrilling. And I felt like you can go through it at this individual level where you go up and you pick a shelf and you could look book by book by book by book. And so it was individually very exciting, but then the collection, the massiveness of these books as visual objects, and as each book is kind of a temple of words, and then you put them all together in one space and you get this amazing thing, which in a way replicates what we as readers have in our heads all the time. And then as a writer, I just found it really exciting to think about what goes into a book. You know, knowing now, having written 3 books, knowing what goes into a book, and then seeing all these books together in one space, it felt like I had kind of come home in this very exciting way. Like this was a place that said, this is the most important thing in the world, which I agree. I think it's the most important thing in the world. And I think a lot of things in our culture conspire to tell us differently. But again, the reason everyone is here today is we all value this endangered, often disrespected thing. You know, it's not in danger in this room, and it's not in danger in that room. And it was thrilling as a writer to see that. So I thought I would talk a little bit today about what went into my last 2 books, just because each one was so different. And again, knowing here are my 2 books, I know what went into each of them, and then you multiply by 2 million, and you realize that every single book has a story behind it, and it made me respect this even more. My first book, as Suzanne mentioned, was a novel, and it was a book that grew out of a short story, and it grew in a kind of linear way. And one of the things I have found, having completed a book, I always neaten it up in my mind. I mean, if you were to ask me how my books got written, I would just say, oh, they wrote themselves. And it's just baloney. You know, each book is a struggle, and I've found that having written 3 books, each of the 3 books was a different kind of struggle. So the first book was a kind of a linear progression. I wrote a short story. It was the first short story I ever published, and it became chapter 1 of the novel. So I did the very good girl thing of developing a novel out of a short story. So that was, you know, a long time ago. So then, while I was in the middle of writing that book, my father killed himself, and that was one of those events that completely shakes everything you know about the world, really. I mean, my father was a very lovely, loving, gracious man, and never gave a sign of being depressed, and just this event was, you know, out of the blue as far as we were concerned. And the thing that was really weird about his death was when I first heard that he had died this way, my first response was to think, oh no, he couldn't possibly have done that. He never would have done that. It was, you know, outside of the realm of his character, and so it's impossible. But then there was this other part of me that said, oh my God, of course. And I think that first paradox of how could I have at the same time thought, no way, and of course. And that was, I think, the germ of this book that became the Suicide Index. But it took me 10 years, over 10 years, to write the book. And I think the reason it took so long was I kept trying to follow all of the rules that writers follow when they write books. I tried to, first I thought I would write a novel about a family in which the father commits suicide. And you can already hear from me in that description how much I was trying to hold it at arm's length. I hoped that I could do it in this kind of elegant, detached way and not really have to deal with the feelings, which were messy and scary and, you know, funny sometimes. You know, I'm sure other people here know that, you know, in any family tragedy, there's stuff that's just cuckoo and ridiculous. And I wanted to get all of that in there, and I wanted to get in the mess, you know, the mess of an event like this, because, you know, if you're going to write about something like that, I think you have to do it really honestly, or I think you're breaking the deal you have with your reader. I think if you're going to take on a subject, you have to really take it on, or you're kind of betraying. If you neaten it up too much, you're lying to your reader. And I just didn't want to do that. So I worked on it for years. I tried to write this kind of chronological novel, didn't work. I tried all the tricks that writers do. Maybe it needed flashbacks, maybe it needed to be first person, no, maybe it needed to be third person. And after a while, I just realized this is just not working. I put it aside and I considered it a failure. And then after about another year and a half, I took the book out again. I went to the MacDowell colony, and so I had a month alone in a cabin in the woods to just work on my writing. I took the book out again, and I realized that I had not really told the story in a way that was true to the story, and that there was a way that the story of a suicide does not follow a chronological linear path. You know, it's not one of these things where the event happens and then you kind of have this journey and progress, and that was just baloney. I couldn't write that because it just was not the way my experience of my father's death was. My experience of my father's death was he died, and in his death he created a mystery, and it was a mystery that I had to solve, and yet I couldn't solve it. And I started to realize that the very unsolvability of that mystery, that was the story, and that I needed to find a way to tell that story in a way that showed how chaotic it really is, that experience of losing a parent to suicide. So I ended up writing all these little fragments. I wrote One fragment was 40 pages long, one fragment was 1 word long. And I put those fragments together and realized, like, this is true to the experience. Like, it doesn't fit into all the nice little rules that I learned about writing. It has to have its own set of rules and its own way of being a story. So there are chapters in the book that are from my point of view in first person. There are chapters that are, kind of almost fiction from my father's point of view, but I'm clear, that that's what that is. I'm not trying to present that as memoir. And it ended up being this book of all these different fragments. And eventually I came up with this idea of organizing the book as an index. So literally, when you start the book, the first thing you see is this index, and it's suicide, act of, attempt to imagine, bare bones account, immediate aftermath, suicide, anger about, suicide, attitude toward, his, mine, suicide, belief that change of scene might unlock emotion concerning. And what I did was I took that form of the index, which is such a formal, organized, orderly form, and I imposed it on this kind of chaotic set of events. And I think what it did was it put the events in order, but it also pointed out the impossibility of putting the events in order. You cannot put those events in order. They just do not work that way. And there was something so liberating as a writer, finding the right way to tell that story. It just made me realize that with books, as a writer, you have to be very patient, and you can't, sometimes the agony of being in process is so hard that you just want it to be done already. And I realized my job as a writer is to resist that, because I owe it to the story, and I owe it to the eventual reader of the story to really find the right way to tell that story. And it's different with every book. And that's also a revelation to me. I sort of thought once you had written a book, you knew how to write a book. And I realized, no, once you've written a book, you know how to write that book. But then you have to start over again, and you don't know how to write the new book at all. So with the suicide index, I discovered that even when you're writing about something difficult, there's such joy in finally finding the right way to tell it, and to find a form that allowed the humor and allowed the kind of the general family-ness of the story. It was a story about suicide, but I think suicide is one of those subjects. I also found when I was writing this book, if people said, "What are you working on?" And I said, "Well, I'm writing a book about my father's suicide," they would kind of go like, "Oh." And it's a subject that scares the hell out of people. And that, I get it. I get why it scares people, but I also feel like it's kind of a universal subject. I mean, once you start to talk about suicide, you find out that everybody knows somebody. Everybody has experience with it in some way or another. And I also felt like I wanted to show that I think there was a way that before this happened in my family, I think I almost, it's embarrassing to admit this, but I almost thought that when stuff like this happened in families, it was like over there. I didn't realize that basically sooner or later something happens in every family. And if it's not this, it's something else. But we all have whatever those experiences are that are the really life-changing experiences, the thing that happens in your family that you thought could never happen in your family. We all know what that is. And so I think that's another thing that another piece of the territory that I was exploring with the suicide index. So as I said, that book took years and years and years to write, and it was a very difficult process, but also really relief to finally get the story right. So when that was done, I really, really, really wanted to do something completely different. And so, as Suzanne said in her introduction, I started with this idea of what if I wrote a collection of stories that all had the same title, The News from Spain, and the title meant something really different in each story. And each story has to be called that. I didn't want it to be like some gimmick title plopped on a story. I wanted it to really feel like this story had to be called The News from Spain for this reason, and that story had to be called The News from Spain for that reason, but I wanted it to feel really different. And I also wanted, it's funny, I found that each book has its own, I don't know how to say this, but each book has its own thing that people recoil from. So with the suicide book, it was the subject, suicide, no thank you, I don't want to read that. And with The News from Spain, I think people love the idea of love stories, But when they hear the book is short stories, it's like, no thanks, I don't like short stories, I only like novels. And I feel like I know what those people mean, because there are a lot of short stories that really bug me, because I feel like I don't understand why they start where they start, I don't understand why they end where they end. So I really wanted to write stories that felt like little novels, like that felt like you got so much of the characters that you could leave them where they're left and kind of know that their lives continue outside the frame. So I really wanted to write love stories that felt like they were little portraits of people's lives and the kinds of misunderstandings and miscues that smart people have in their lives, where you kind of, you get it right, but you also get it wrong, and you're in the middle of a happy moment, but then there's something about the moment that's not quite right, and then you get something explodes out of that, or something doesn't explode, or whatever. And I'll just read you a quick little scene of the kind. This is from the second story in the book, where the love affair in this story actually really is, this story is really about the love between a mother and a daughter. The mother is in a nursing home, and the daughter's been kind of taking care of her for years. And the daughter has kind of this busy romantic life, which is the excerpt I'll read you. But the real love in the story is between the mother and the daughter. They have this prickly, tense relationship where they're just, my mother and I were much too frank with each other. We didn't know how to not say something. If we had a thought, we said it. And so I really wanted to try to capture that kind of relationship. But I'll just read you a little thing about the daughter's romantic life so you'll get a sense of what the tone of the book is. The daughter's name is Rebecca, and she's been seeing a man named Peter. She's been seeing Peter for a long time. They enjoy each other. They trust each other. They spend a few nights together most weeks, but both of them like having their own apartments. Early on, a couple of years into their relationship, Peter asked Rebecca how she would feel about getting married. That was how he did it. Not a proposal, but an introduction of a topic for discussion. She said she wasn't sure. This lovely, good, thoughtful man, what was the matter with her? She was nervous and also miffed that he seemed so equable about the whole thing, that he wasn't made desperate by her ambivalence, that he wasn't knocking her over with forceful demands that she belonged to him. On the other hand, she wasn't knocking him over either. Then his book on Richardson was finished and published. He brought over a copy one night, and she had a bottle of champagne waiting. "Peter, I'm so happy for you." And she kissed him, and they smiled at each other and drank, and she kept touching the cover of the book. Then he went into her kitchen to carve the chicken, and she began to flip through the book. She turned to the acknowledgments page, and her own name jumped out at her. "And to Rebecca Hunt, who has given me so many pleasant hours." It was understatement, wasn't it? The kind of understatement that can exist between two people who understand each other, the kind she was always wishing for and never getting from her mother. What did she want? A dedication that said, "For Rebecca, whom I adore and would die for"? Here was something she suddenly saw and deplored in herself, something she seemed to have in common with her mother, a raw belief that love had to be declared and proved, baldly, loudly, explicitly. She saw the danger, the wrongness of this, yet when Peter came in from the kitchen, carrying the chicken over to the table Rebecca had set in front of the fireplace, she said, "Pleasant? Is that what I've given you, many pleasant hours?" "Some unpleasant ones, too," he said, humorously. Nervously, he saw suddenly what was coming, and he was trying to head it off. So I just feel like, to me, that little moment of, a book dedication that's meant to be a loving moment, but it sort of goes wrong. That's, Rebecca, the character in the story, wonders about things, whether things are a revelation or an aberration. Is this something that really tells me something about this relationship that's important, or is this just a glitch? And a lot of the people in this book are kind of wondering that in their relationships. I wanted to write stories that were kind of asymmetrical love stories. So there's one story that's about a formerly famous ballerina who's married to a famous choreographer, and she had an illness that paralyzed her. So she's home in a New York apartment in a wheelchair, while her famous husband, the choreographer, is off in Europe with a troupe of dancers, including a new ballerina that he's madly in love with. She's stuck in this New York apartment with this young gay caretaker who has to, pick her up out of the wheelchair and do everything for her. And the love story in that, she's yearning after her husband, he's yearning after the guy in the company that he's in love with, but the real love story in that story is between the two of them and what their relationship is. It's not a romantic relationship, it's not a sexual relationship, but it's a love story. In the same way that in the one I just read you, the real love is between the mother and the daughter. So I was interested in romantic love, certainly, but I was also interested in the other kinds of love we have in our lives and the other kinds of miscues and misjudgments that we make. And as I wrote the book, I started to find that these stories were talking to each other in a way that was very exciting to me as a writer. It just felt like the more I wrote it, the more alive it got, which was the same thing that had happened with the suicide book eventually. It just starts to have a life. You feel like you're working with a live thing, and it's very exciting. It's like you're talking to the book and the book's talking to you. And as this book went along, I found that the themes were becoming more and more clear, that I was writing about the ways in which we can experience love as something humiliating, which I think a lot of us know what that feels like, or you can experience your own passionate feelings as something quite lovely and dignified, even when they seem to be coloring outside the lines in some way. And the last story in the book is the one where that got the most explicit. I actually was thinking about Eleanor Roosevelt, who I hadn't known this before, but as I was doing research, I found that Eleanor Roosevelt, when she was 62, she fell madly in love with her doctor, who was 45. And she just had this huge, I guess you would say she had this huge crush on him, which he returned up to a point. I think for him it was a very deep love tinged with enormous respect. But for her, it was head over heels, nutty romantic love. And she did not find this embarrassing. She was just very straight with him about it. She told him she didn't expect much back from him. And so the two of them had this relationship, which was, a love affair of a kind, but a kind that we don't normally, when you think about that story, this older woman falling in love with this much younger man who is married and has an active romantic life, it feels like, ooh, that's so embarrassing. And she was not embarrassed at all. And I was really interested in this book in writing about the ways in which love that looks weird can actually be totally normal. We'd have to expand our definition of love. So I think this book also ended up being a kind of orderly structure imposed on messy material. Like the suicide book was the orderly index structure imposed on suicide, which is a big mess. And this is the orderly naming the stories all the same thing imposed on the mess of love. So I felt like both of those were really joyful books ultimately to write, and I hope they're joyful books to read. So those are just two stories of two books. And again, if you multiply, we've got, 4 writers here today, 5 writers here today, and many more writers probably sitting here. And so you just take that and you just keep multiplying, and you get this amazing multiplicity of things. And I'll close by saying, I was asked to write an essay this year for an anthology, which maybe some of you have seen, called My Bookstore. And it was a bunch of writers. I think they ended up with something like 75 writers, each writing about a bookstore. And the bookstore that asked me to write about it was a bookstore up in New Hampshire called the Toadstool in Peterborough, New Hampshire, which is a fantastic bookstore. And it's also right down the road from McDowell, which is the place that I've gone to work. And in fact, most of the Suicide Index was written there, and most of the news from Spain was written there. And I realized when I go into the Toadstool, the thing that's really exciting to me is you're in a bookstore, but you're also right down the road from this place where all these writers are working on books. And it just suddenly made me realize every time you're in a bookstore and every time you're in a library, you're seeing all these finished objects, and every single one of them was once a work in progress. And I think that's what I was so thrilled with Stockholm, with that library, is just realizing, like, this is what happens when every writer puts a drop every writer puts a little drop in the ocean, and then you end up with something like this. So thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Joan. And I know we have a lot of readers here. We have some writers too. I think we're inspired on both sides to read, certainly your books, all those, if we know Swedish, and also to get out there and see how we can tell our stories. Oh, look at that. It's like Star Trek or something. But I loved what you said about cheating the reader if you're not telling the truth. And so why bother to tell a story? And that can happen in fiction too if you don't tell it fully. And it sounds like every one of those stories that you certainly did write them as a full piece. And that's another challenge for us too. And I love hearing stories behind the stories too. And the idea that you went and you saw the final product in that whole building, but right now there are, and I know some people in this room are doing it, they're writing away if they're not already finished. And so that's happening in this room. We have people that one day will be on those shelves. And along those lines, the next three folks we'll be hearing from are people who have, for the first time, books new to any shelf, and that's really exciting. I just picked up on my table, you'll find them on yours too, the top picks for book clubs by all our authors today, so remember to take a copy of that home. And we have been compiling those, thanks to Brianna, for the past 5 sessions that we've had of this over the 5 years. And you can find those online on the same page on BayPath that has the bookies information. So if you just Google, are you a bookie BayPath, that should come up and you'll find lists and lists and lists if you're ever just sitting around wondering what to read next. But you will have so many ideas after today. I don't have kids, and now that I've gotten more and more into both writing and teaching writers, I feel like every one of my books is a little child that goes out into the world and does whatever the heck's going to happen to it. You know, you try to do your best with it, and then it goes out there, and you hope people will like it and all that. But now that I'm teaching more and more writers, and they have their own books, I just feel sort of like I'm related to them now, and so I'm really thrilled now next to present to you Cal Armistead, who is the author of the newly released Being Henry David, which I love this cover. Cal has been a writer since age 9. If any of you read her bio online, I love this part. She submitted her first book, The Poor Macaroni Named Joni, to a publisher. Don't you love that? And never grabbed by a publisher, but Cal forged on, and she wrote a whole lot for radio, newspapers, magazines, again, doing that stretching that Joan does so well. And her pieces ran in publications including the Chicago Tribune, Body and Soul magazine, which I loved, and the Christian Science Monitor. It was when she began writing and writing and writing copiously for the University of Southern Maine's MFA program in creative writing, where I teach, that I first encountered her. I can say I knew Cal when, which is very exciting. And that even back then, how long was that? What year did you graduate? 2007, yeah. So wow, that's a while ago already. And when I first encountered her, I felt even back then that she had what it takes to do the work so well and also to get it out there. Her characters, no matter the age, and she's especially good at writing young adult characters, but I would encourage readers of any age to read her work because it has just reality and truth for all of us. They're so memorable for their believable emotions and language. And it's her skill for creating that reality that's made Being Henry David a hit despite being only out a few months. Telling the story of a teen who finds himself at Penn Station with no memory and only a copy of Henry David Thoreau's Walden, and then setting him on a path for the actual Walden and the discovery of what his life was before that awakening. Cal delivers a mature, thoughtful, and intimate story of a boy's literal search for himself, both the good and bad of whatever was his past story. At my Wednesday group, I think 2 weeks ago, I mentioned the plot vending machine that I'd love to invent, where you can, you're stuck for ideas and you go up, you put your quarter in because that one looks good. Well, if I saw, a kid wakes up, who am I? And I've only got this book, and that's going to hopefully lead me to where I am. I'd say, okay, I'm putting my money in for that one. I love the idea behind this. And also how she pulled it off. I love, again, the story behind the story. If you've heard of NaNoWriMo, those of you who might be writers, it's the National Write a Novel in a Month. Every November. This costs you nothing, only time. So go online and Google NaNoWriMo. NaNoWriMo, and it encourages people to log on and submit their pages or just become part of that daily writing with the goal of writing 50,000 words with your peers every November. And it can lead to some amazing things. As Cal said, it took me only a couple years after that to polish the book into a reasonable manuscript, but it gave me a starting point, like the lump of clay on a potter's wheel that might someday be molded into a nice fruit bowl or something, she says. This book is really something, as is this author. So let's welcome all the way from Concord, Mass., Cal Armistead.
Thank you, Suzanne. Now, Suzanne is very special to me because not only was she my instructor at Stone Coast, she was the first person to mention Stone Coast to me at the main writers' conference back like 10 years ago. That was the first I'd ever heard of it, and I ended up going and graduating and meeting her. You are definitely a godparent of this book. You are. This is family. This is family here. So. Yes, the synopsis of my book, I loved being able to weave Thoreau into this. And an interesting story behind the story is that when I was not much older than my character, who is 17 and he turns 18, I myself was a little bit adrift and ended up living at my uncle's house in Concord, Massachusetts, and walking around Walden Pond trying to get my bearings. And so it wasn't until after my book was already accepted for publication that I realized that Hank's journey for his identity was similar to me searching for my identity. It was totally subconscious. Even though, of course, I didn't have amnesia, it's still, that place just represents to me a place where I was able to mold my adult identity and get my life started. So that's a brief thing about the story behind that story. One of the reasons that we're here is book clubs, and I did want to share with you a couple of things. This was written for young adults. I've been very excited to hear from teachers who have said that their reluctant readers in junior high have been loving my book. That's a high compliment. But also, I work at a bookstore in Acton, Massachusetts called Willow Books that I absolutely love. And people have been coming in, adults have been coming in to buy my book and saying, oh yes, this is our book club choice for this month. And I was really thrilled to hear that. And then also, if anybody here follows Goodreads, there have been a couple of reviews that people have written where they have said, oh, I understand why there's all this buzz about this book crossing over into the adult market. Also very exciting news for me because I have a lot of adults who have been telling me how much they connect to the story and the journey and the connection with Thoreau, who is kind of a spirit guide for my character, which has been really wonderful. I also wanted to note that on the front of here is the motto for Bay Path College is Carpe Diem, and I was so amazed by the harmonics of that because Carpe Diem is a term that I use a lot in my book. Thoreau didn't use that term. He said, we need to suck out the very marrow of life, which is the same concept. But Carpe Diem is a term that my character uses a lot, and it's also the name of his band that he has in the Battle of the Bands in my book, which is a scene that takes place near the end. So I just thought that was really kind of cool, Carpe Diem. And also I love the movie The Dead Poets Society, so it all kind of comes together. Now, I don't know how much time I have to speak. I'm thinking not too much, so should I go straight into my reading? I'll read a little bit from this book. This is a scene where we're still in New York City, and my character has been taken in by some street kids, some runaways, who are also lost, but they have made themselves a little place to huddle and sleep in an alley where there's a lot of building material, and made themselves some little lean-tos to kind of live underneath. And so they've taken him under their wing, and so this is his very first night in the street after having woken up in Penn Station without any idea of who he is and what he's doing there. So this is from the first or second chapter of my book. Jack is the name of the street kid that has taken him in. Jack salutes, then disappears into the shack. He and Nessa whisper for a while, and then there are soft sounds that could be laughing or crying. After that, silence. Staring up at the moon, I try to feel sleepy, but now that I'm alone, my mind is racing and I'm wide awake with my heart hammering against my ribs. There are skittering sounds on the other side of the dumpster, probably rats. The wind shifts, and even though the dumpster is mostly full of construction trash, I get a strong whiff of rotting food and random nastiness. I pull a huge plank of particle board out of a pile next to the dumpster, lean it against the back wall of the alley, and huddle underneath it like it can keep me safe. I try to stop my hands from shaking. To calm my twitchy brain, I take a little internal inventory, try to piece together what I know about myself so far. Okay, so I'm a teenage guy, probably somewhere between 16 and 18 years old. Hair black, eyes gray. Not bad looking either. There was only that quick glance in the men's room mirror, but I know that much. I like burgers and soda, and I might be a smoker, although that cigarette left a weird taste in my mouth that kind of makes me want to gag. I have a bump and a cut above my forehead that stings if I touch it. I get real fidgety around the cops. And there's a black beast inside me that doesn't want me to know stuff. It guards my memory, clawing at my insides and going for my throat if I get too close. So why did the beast wake up when Jack said, "Maybe you killed somebody"? Is that what it won't let me remember? The black thing in me surges again, and I feel a pounding headache coming on. "Stop," I whisper, "go away." But it crouches there, waiting to creep closer so it can attack, now while I'm alone and vulnerable. There's a light shining down from the side of the building, bright enough to read by. So I open my book, Walden, by Henry David Thoreau, and that's what I do. This Thoreau guy wrote it in the mid-1800s, so the writing is a little weird for me at first. I have to read some paragraphs over a few times to figure out what he's trying to say. But then I start to get into it. Walden, as it turns out, is named after some pond in the woods in a town called Concord, Massachusetts. Henry David Thoreau was in his late 20s when he went there to get away from the world and live alone in a little cabin for a couple years. He listened to the birds, walked around the pond, and just thought about stuff. Living off the grid, whatever grid there was in 1845. Instead of the stink of the alley and the echo of sirens and honking taxicabs, while I'm reading the book, it's actually like there's fresh air rustling leaves in a tree over my head. I hear the water and birds singing. Somehow I know this place in Henry's book. I can remember being outside like that in the woods near a lake. It's familiar in a way I feel to my bones. It's the closest feeling so far to home.
Thank you, Cal, so much. And you make a great point about YA being for all of us, really, the quality of stories there. I wasn't really aware of until I became a bookseller myself, and many in the room had frequented the late, great Edwards Books downtown. And I saw Janet and Flo Edwards the other day. Some of you might know them. And Flo is now 89, but she was so that store closed in 2007, I believe, and she was the YA buyer. She would read all the YA stuff, and she was right on with like Holes ages before anyone ever heard of it. And you know, so yeah. So yeah, definitely. There's so much there. So thank you for that and for the reading. So on to our next person, David. In November of 1988, David Bergengren sat next to me in a hallway at the Springfield newspapers as we filled out forms for our new jobs as reporters there. He was newly hired. I was returning to the paper after a stint elsewhere. Being a good reporter, I sneaked a peek at what he was writing. I saw a mention of studying film, getting an MFA in creative writing from the University of Massachusetts. Wow, who is this person, I wondered. And I soon found out. As we were placed in the same newspaper bureau, And over the 6 years I worked with him until I left the newspaper business, I came to know Dave as a hardworking, caring, and careful reporter. And along the way, I came to feel he was the big brother I've never had. One of the best examples from my brother here, to get the work done. I think we've been hearing that is the case with all our authors so far, and we will hear with Anna as well. Back then, Dave got the work done. He gave most of every weekend to his own writing, editing, reworking, perfecting, editing again. And he was a wonderful model for me as I began my own stories, the first two of which were published during our years working together. I don't think I've ever thanked him fully for the gift of that quiet example, the time he devoted to writing his 4 novels, a collection of short stories, and a screenplay, more stretching, of doing the work for which he'd yet to have a contract or a deadline, just writing because he loved to and he wanted to get it out there eventually, but he just loved to do the writing, and he felt that he had to. So I was thrilled for him last year on the publication of his first novel, The Fables of La Negra, which focuses so clearly on World War II, victims of the Third Reich, and Germans who resisted Hitler, subjects that enthrall him and that I know fill nearly a room of bookshelves in his home in Florence. He shares that home with his wife, Holly Angelo, now a gerontologist, but back in our days at the newspaper bureau, another fine reporter and a writer who's come to be a dear, dear friend. I hope you'll get to know both of them this afternoon, starting with David and his book right now. So let's welcome David Bergengren.
Well, I think I should say that Suzanne is probably the real role model here, because while I'm spinning my wheels with the same novel, although I did do some things in between, she was churning out 2 novels for publication and then a few more later. So the road went both ways as far as role models go. And she's always been a fantastic friend of ours, along with her husband, Tommy Shea. Joan Wickersham gave me a few things to think about there, lots of things actually, but in particular, a couple of things. Number one, in my novel, The Fables of La Negra, I'm now very happy that my dedication for my wife is For Holly. I didn't get in trouble. I don't think it didn't occur to me that there could be more there, but I thought that kind of said it. Also, what Joan said about every novel really having something in it that can make readers nervous, and I think that that's true about a lot of good ones, especially. Not that I'm necessarily referring to mine, but I was speaking to an old friend of mine from Key West on the phone the other day, and she said she'd read my novel, really liked it, and had given it to her mother to read. She said, I warned my mother, there's a few parts in here, I don't know. But I just took that as a compliment. This story is World War II, but also it runs from 1918 to 1952. It's got a lot of different things in it. And it's got some scenes in concentration camp, which I have no personal experience with, obviously. But I think that makes people nervous sometimes, what I wrote about this. And I understand that, and really it's kind of supposed to. So just briefly, I'm just going to read something real short, but very briefly, I'll explain the context here. And there's a lot of plot in this book, so I'm not going to give anything away, which means that I just got to give you the bare bones, basically. The novel, as I say, is a World War II historical piece. It opens in 1952 with a freelance reporter who lives in New York and who's been impacted, whose family has been devastated basically by World War II. He's on a plane to La Negra, which is a city in South America, to cover the extradition hearing of a man named Johan Richter, who's a former German army officer now accused of war crimes. This is 7 years after the end of the war, but this is what he's going to do. And he's got his own personal reasons for going, which I won't go into because that's part of the novel. So anyway, the novel after that goes back and forth in point of view and time period between 1952, what's happening in and around La Negra, and and then the past of these two men, Michael Cohen and Johann Richter, before, during, and after the war. And so some of the main characters include Christine Johns, who is the sister of the Clay Johns, and the aristocratic young man who Richter has gone to school with in England before the war. And Clay Johns himself is also a character. Elena Stein, who Richter winds up with in South America after the war. Rachel Stern, who is a survivor of the concentration camps, who gets involved after the war in the Israeli War for Independence, who has a very complicated relationship with Cohen, the man going to La Negra. And also Karl von Richter, who's Johann Richter's father, a member of the German General Staff, who's been involved in anti-Hitler clique in the military from way back at the beginning in the early 1930s. Eventually, they become involved in attempts to kill Hitler during the war. And the little excerpt I'm going to read is a teaser at the start, taken from further into the novel, about Johann Richter's own attempt to kill Hitler. So, this is just a little teaser right before chapter 1. And by the way, Ostmark is what the Nazis called occupied Austria during the war. 22 August 1944, Salzburg, Ostmark. There was a good chance he was about to commit suicide, Johann Richter knew. He checked and rechecked the rifle a dozen times, noting the irony of its American manufacture. His father had never shared Hitler's down-the-nose attitude toward Americans and their products, and he kept the weapon in excellent condition. The more likely problem would be his own marksmanship. His target would be well over 100 meters away at a long downhill angle. It would be a difficult shot. He would need luck as well as a firm hand. Finally, shortly after 5:45, with the sun still strong, a motorized escort pulled into the parking lot of the train station. A double cordon of SS men flanked 4 limousines as they disgorged a small torrent of military VIPs. Richter held his breath to flatten out any potential shakiness. This was not the moment to falter. He tried to pick Hitler apart from the rest with a Remington sniper sight. When he didn't spot him, he had to force himself not to panic. He could hear his own strained breathing. Each time he inhaled, he grew more nauseous at the smell of gun grease from the well-oiled firearm cradled against his cheek. The first of the high-ranking officers was already nearing the station building. From out of nowhere, Adolf Hitler suddenly appeared in Richter's sights. He took steady aim at the instantly recognizable profile, asking God to forgive him for what he was about to do. His body relaxed and an immense feeling of relief flooded through him. It felt as if a force outside him had taken control of the rifle. But as he touched his index finger to the trigger and slowly, carefully increased the pressure, the telescopic sight abruptly turned fire red. Hitler's profile had been replaced by the brick wall of the station building. Richter had missed his chance, maybe his only chance. He was furious, frantic. Then very quickly it appeared he would have one more opening as Hitler's entourage began moving out from the protective cover of the building and down along the open platform to the rear of the train. He scanned the crowd of uniforms. Hitler was about to board the train but had stopped to confer with a Kriegsmarine admiral. This time the Fuhrer was facing Richter directly. He looked somehow different, heavier perhaps, more jowly. Aiming at the bridge of his nose, Richter experienced one last wave of doubt. Palms sweating, fingers icy, unable to make the final irrevocable decision, he pictured all he had lost because of this man, and finally let his finger move against the trigger. For a split second, perhaps hearing the gun's report, Hitler stared straight up the sniper sight, a look of startled recognition on his face. And chapter 1. Thank you.
Thanks, Dave. There's such an art to doing a reading, you know. You want to leave people wanting to turn the page. That certainly does. That's such a great way to start that book, too. You know, we want to just leap into it. So thank you so much. And our last author who will be reading and speaking is Bozena Bowen. She's a poet, a writer, and a holistic nurse, and an intuitive. What a great lineup of abilities. And I wonder what I would have thought if she were filling out an employment application next to me at some point. I'm looking over and going, who is this person? We're going to get to know a little bit of who she is today. Some bare facts. Anna was the first American-born child to her Polish immigrant parents, and she was raised in a Polish community in Holyoke. Her holistic approach to life and connection to spirit is evidenced in her first novel, Hattie, one she probably wouldn't have written if she hadn't answered the call of her interest in writing and taken a summer course in the short story at Holyoke Community College. So sometimes we take these little courses and they can grow into many things. And in her case, it was a main character who was a washerwoman, a wife, and a mother who endures no small amount of tragedies and trauma, yet perseveres as a wonderful example of spirit. She emerged in journal entries Anna was writing during a time of her own healing. And Anna calls Hattie's story a testament to the multidimensional aspects of our human and spiritual lives. It is about the in-between and beyond. It is about being human. It is about soul and spirit and so much more. And it is finding readers and acclaim. Anna really is just back, last night, from the enormous Book Expo America in New York City. And on that trip alone, she collected for Hattie, a Next Generation Indie Book Award for General Fiction, another for Best Design in Fiction, a Benjamin Franklin Silver Award in Popular Fiction, a Silver Independent Publishers Book Award called the IPPY, a silver medal for visionary fiction. Am I missing one? I think there were 5, right? Finalist in women's issues, 5 awards. We'll add our applause today as we welcome Annie and Hattie today to the podium all the way from South Hadley, our final reader of the day.
Hello, everyone. I'm thrilled to be here, and I really have to thank Suzanne, not just for inviting me here today, but also the inspiration she lent me back many years ago when she had her book launch party for Selling the Light of Heaven at the Odyssey bookstore. I'll never forget the pierogis her mom made and the refreshments that were served, along with a fantastic reading that Suzanne did. And so when I had my book launch party at the Odyssey in November, I remembered much of what I learned from you, and it was very successful. And though my sister probably would have made gołąbki had I asked her to, but we ended up having it catered by Food 101, which was really great too. I am just back from New York and gathering awards. I'm thrilled, I'm honored, I feel blessed, and a lot of gratitude. And one of the things that makes being here today with all of you, especially those of you who are in book clubs, so special is that I ended up, because of comments that I was getting over the years as I was reading from Hattie. Now, Hattie has been written for over 20 years, and I held my novel for that period of time because I was just waiting for the right time, for it to feel like the right time. But as I read from Hattie, I would continually, and I have to say, always have people coming up to me with questions, with comments, and I realized how much my literary novel was generating discussion. And then when Hattie was going through the editing process and different people were reading it, same thing, they were coming to me with numerous questions and saying how thought-provoking Hattie is, and what does this mean, and what about this? And so I decided, rather towards the end of the editing process, to add a conversation guide with discussion questions at the end of my novel. And so this was done to inspire individual readers who wanted to delve more deeply into meanings in my novel, and also to facilitate discussion in book clubs. And one of the things that I've come away from just after listening to Joan and the other authors, I did a little research on book clubs and came across this quote: "Probably the most important criteria for a book, that a book be well written and that it explores basic human truths. Good books for discussion have three-dimensional characters dealing with life issues readers can identify with. Characters who are forced to make difficult choices under difficult situations, whose behaviors sometimes make sense and sometimes don't." And I think, listening to the other authors, I think we were all fortunate enough to bring those kinds of characters to life in our stories and in our books. I am going to read a short selection from Hattie. This is at a time when Hattie was encouraged by her midwife to go to see a soothsayer. And the midwife said to Hattie, the midwife's name is Adelphia, "This isn't about fortune," she said. "This is about life." I thought Adelphia could have done the same for me. She insisted she could not. Though she herself had a gift for knowing things, she said that she was too attached to me. Some things were not meant to pass between us. She said that she was my midwife and she was my friend, and that certain knowings, as she called them, I was meant to get from others. So I went. It was a cold, cold day. I bundled myself up from head to foot and wrapped a cloth like a scarf around my face. It wasn't a scarf. It was meant to be something larger. It was something I had started piecing together from bits of fabric a long time before. I had pulled it out of the trunk where I stored things that weren't used much, or things that were not yet what they were supposed to be. I couldn't remember what my intentions were for this piece of work, but on this day I needed to keep warm, and so a scarf it became. That cold day I walked 5 miles to Ada's house. I was told it was set way up in the woods that I hardly ever walked in. One might think, considering there was not too much up in those woods, that they were hardly ever walked by anyone. Yet the surprisingly well-worn path I followed told me that many a woman, at some point in her life, had journeyed to Ada the soothsayer's house, had at some time been driven by a desperate need to be given a sign or bit of hope, something, anything, that could be placed in the palm of the hand and remind that hand that it still knew how to gather and hold things. When I got to where I was supposed to be, I found myself looking at a small hut standing between 2 huge trees. The sides of the shack were sunk in by the tree trunks pressing against them. It seemed like the trees in the shack were a part of each other. Adelphia had told me to just walk into the place upon my arrival, as Ada was quite deaf and would not hear my knock. "She'll know you're on your way," Adelphia had said, "so just go on in." As I went up the stairs that hardly resembled stairs at all, there were more holes than planks, holes big enough for my feet to get stuck in if they made a wrong step. I wondered if this was worth doing. What if she couldn't hear what I said to her or asked of her? And I wasn't even sure I would ask her anything. I creaked through the door, or maybe the door creaked through me. I wasn't sure of anything except that something creaked loudly as I pushed the door open and closed it behind me. On my walk to this place, stones kept getting stuck in a couple holes in the soles of my shoes. I had to keep stopping to pull them out. As I stepped into the shack, I realized I still held one stone in my hand and was clutching it tightly. Before I was able to look around the dimly lit room, I heard Ada say, "Come in closer. Show me what you hold." Thank you.
Thank you so much. And again, another great place to stop. And Excuse me? Yes, they are. Yes, yeah. I just wanted to give you your definitely. And just to say, no pierogies today, but we do have wonderful food over here, including some cake, I think. And so help yourself, but also now we're going to have a question and answer portion before we do some signings and chat with our authors. So if the other authors would come up and please take a seat. And oh, sure. Yeah. And help yourself to a place. Don't forget your. Oh, that's really fuzzy. That's nice. Yeah. So, does anyone have questions for our authors? New work coming up? How they get published? Favorite color? Anything? Yes. Hi.
Hi, I'm Susan J. Kaplan. I run a nonprofit called Into Libraries, and I wanted to let Joan know that, excuse me, I don't mean Joan, I'm sorry. Cal knows that we don't usually do middle schools, but your book has been on our middle school list.
Oh.
And we've had a lot of requests for it, and I sadly did not know the book, but I do now. But we've had a lot of, we give books in 3 states, 58,000 books this year, new books to underserved children. And that book has been asked for 4 times in the last 10 days. So it's very
Isn't that wonderful? Susan, thank you for announcing that. And thanks for being here too. Susan does amazing work in our community and in other communities we've probably never been to, getting books to readers who otherwise wouldn't have them. So thank you for that. And yeah, that's great news. Anyone else have a question?
Let's see, can I say something?
What? Yeah.
I meant to say something as I was talking about the discussion guide at the end, which I forgot to say, is I would suggest not reading those questions before you finish the book, because it will it will reveal certain things that you would probably rather come to in your reading.
Very good. That's a good point. Oh yes, Barry.
I have a question for Joan. I'm almost done with News from Spain. I'm really enjoying it a lot. The first short story in the book that I was particularly taken with, and I was wondering, when you started writing that story, because there's several themes of love that are kind of going in different directions, falling apart, have limits to them, and what did you start with? Which relationship did you start with on that?
Yeah, that's really interesting. I don't know if everybody could hear the question, but the question is, in the first short story in the News from Spain, there are a number of different intertwined love stories in that story. And in fact, in each story in the book, there are several different love stories going on. And so the question was, what did I start with? This book, I had the wonderful experience of each story came out pretty much the way you see it. So where I started with that story was the first sentence. It was just all there suddenly. And the adjustment that I made in that story, it's 2 different couples. One is a couple that is a husband and wife that have been married for, almost 20 years, and or I think more than 20 years, and she's just found out that he had a brief affair. And so she's trying to figure out, she knows she wants to forgive him, but she can't quite. And they're on their way to an engagement party, which is the engagement between another couple that is, the man in that couple is kind of ambivalent about getting married. They're both in their mid-40s and they can't decide, they sort of know it's time to get married, but they're not sure. And so there's those 2 couples are the focus of the story, and it kind of goes back and forth between the 2 couples. And the adjustment I made in that story was I actually had a 3rd couple in there at one point. And I got stuck when I was writing. I just couldn't move. The story just kind of, when the car stalls when you're on the highway, it just stalls. You can't get it to go. And the story had just stalled. And I suddenly realized it's just I'm trying to make this as much like a novel as I can, but this is getting too much like a novel. Just too much going on. So yeah, I just took out that 3rd couple, and then all of a sudden the story just started to move.
And if I could have a follow-up question to that, about how long did it take for that story to really come together and write until you got the rewriting of it and
Yeah.
satisfied?
It was really fast. The stories, the news from Spain, the book took off. I had a 5-week residency at McDowell, and during that 5-week period, I wrote that story. I wrote the second story, which I read from today, about the mother and the daughter, and then I also wrote, there's a story about a race car driver's widow and the biographer that comes to visit her to interview her. And the love in that story is actually really between her and the biographer's wife, just about the relationship that happens between them. So those 3 stories I wrote in a month, and that's when I knew I had a book.
Those are my favorite stories.
Oh, good.
Perfect. Great, thank you. Another question? Yes, hi, Michelle, and then I'll get.
Would each of you mind telling a little bit about your process? Are you an outliner or a seat-of-the-pants writer or that sort of thing?
Well, I'll start, and I'll just say again, it depends on the book. For the news from Spain, it just, as I said, it kind of almost came out. The stories, I wrote them all while I was away at residencies. I needed to be out of my life. I needed to be away from the laundry and the phone and all that stuff. But once I was away and I had the time, each story kind of came out whole. And then I wrote several stories that I just threw out because I didn't think they were really good enough to be in the book. And with the Suicide Index, I was just noodling around for 10 years. And I thought it was very interesting that Anna said she was working on her book for 20 years. And I just think books they really take a long time. And I wish someone had explained that to me at the beginning of my career, because I just felt for years like I was just doing it wrong. And I think it's just something that it's good for people to ask writers about that, because the answer is always, I was blundering around in the dark for a really long time before I knew what I was doing. And I think it's very comforting for writers to hear that about each other, because otherwise you really can feel like you're doing it wrong.
For me, I'm not very organized in general, and so to outline sounds like torture to me. I'm just much more creative, and so as Suzanne mentioned, I've done NaNoWriMo, which is National Novel Writing Month, where you write a novel in 50,000 words in a month. And the thing about that works for me is that you turn off your inner editor and you just get the story out. That's what the whole idea is. And I have a tendency to over polish every sentence. So if I did that, I would never have gotten a novel done. So for me, to get the whole thing out in 1 month was fabulous, and then that's better than an outline, because you have your whole book, and it changes quite a bit from your first lump of clay to the finished product. But I find that works for me, to just turn off that inner editor, and I do that now. Each chapter that I do it in that same fashion, even as I'm rewriting it, because I find I'm much more creative if I just let it come out. And then I come up, and then a lot of it is really terrible, but then I can smooth it and make it better. But that's my, get your lump of clay is my basic process.
In similar fashion, the novel, The Fables of the Negro, was written over a long period of time, like Cal's, but with things in between, like a couple other novels. I wrote a lot of it. I went away from it. I originally wrote it coming out of graduate film school in California, and it wasn't a screenplay. I just written a screenplay, but it was written with film kind of in mind, because that's what I'd been working on during that time. And so I let it just gestate, and then a number of years ago, I think it was the movie, Steven Spielberg's. Thank you, Schindler's List. Thank you. See, that's why I dedicated that book to him. As a Schindler's List. Just all of a sudden, I was just finishing another novel. I was a little bit dissatisfied with it, and I thought, you know what? I'm going to go back and do this again. And this time, I really had to get more serious about the outlining part and whatnot, because I turned it into there was a core of a story, which I turned into a much more elaborate story with different times and a lot of different aspects, a lot of dimensions didn't have before. So I really had to get serious about outlining there. And the book I'm working on right now it started as a collection of stories based in Key West, Florida, where I've lived several times. And that's interesting too, because to me, at least, because what I do with that book, which is becoming a novel, is the stories have been written over a long period of time, but all of a sudden I started getting all these ideas. So I keep a notebook by my bed at night, and in the morning I wake up with all these ideas that I throw into it. So it is now going to require a lot of organizing of what I've got. I've got a ton of raw material. And so I agree with everybody here, each one is different. Each piece of work is different, but it's all very interesting, and it's what holds a writer's attention, I think.
I would say with Hattie, because Hattie is my debut novel, that I couldn't actually imagine for myself writing a fiction book that I outlined. And Hattie came to me by connecting with the voice and energy of this character, and the book grew from, she developed the story in a way. It was a surprise to me as things happened, and oftentimes as I was writing, sometimes I'd be like, oh no, this is where I want this to go, and I would definitely get detoured off my path because that was not right for the character. And so I finally accepted that the character was developing the story and I was writing it. And that's how it happened. And actually it took me about 7 years to write Hattie, and then I just held the novel until last year. And the novel itself didn't change. It really stayed in the order in which it was written. The one thing that I realize is to my benefit is that over those years of holding the novel, I grew in wisdom and experience and in understanding, and so I can speak to the complexity and some of the multi-layered issues in the novel in a much fuller way now than I could have even 10 years ago. So, and maybe I won't say never to doing an outline, but for me, I think I would do it if I was doing a nonfiction, but a fiction book, I can't imagine doing that.
Very good. Thank you. You had a question here. Yes.
David, did you have to travel to do research for this novel? Did you have to go to South America and Germany?
No, actually, this is an old colleague from the newspaper, Barry here, was asking me about that earlier. And this period of history is something that's intrigued me from the very start. I don't know when it began, frankly. I mean, I was a history major in college as an undergraduate, and I studied in particular modern European history, and it's been with me. So this is kind of a like write what you know type of thing, but a historical novel version of that. So I knew a lot of this stuff. However, as I just told Barry, it required a lot of research to pin things down. I knew things about this, that, and things that were happening in Germany during the war, before the war, in England. England, France, and Germany are really kind of the main places it takes place in Europe. And I had to go back and research all sorts of things. And I had to research old New York Times stories for different things. And I have, as Suzanne pointed out, I have my World War II library at home. So I have a lot of stuff right there. But now that we got the internet and whatnot, that's also very useful. I didn't have to travel much. I have traveled at one time or another and gone to these places. I dragged my wife and a good friend of ours around to find Hitler's bunker. We were in Berlin a few years ago. And everybody protesting. But no, I didn't actually specifically have to go out there, but it didn't require a lot of research. So.
Thank you.
But, by the way, I'd just like to say that this is just an aside, and now I'm sitting up here and just looking around. Thank God for women. My goodness, we got 95%, so thank you very much.
Yes. Yeah. At a women's college, we like that. Yeah. Sister Jane, did you have a question?
I did. I have two actually. One is, how do you know when a book is done? And the second one is, could any one of you talk about a character who won't go away from you?
Those are wonderful questions. For me, the way I know a book is done is there's a line that I put in the Suicide Index about writing about my father where I said that I wondered if there would ever come a moment where I just finished with the story and that it would be almost like a picture that keeps falling off the wall until you find the right hook or adhesive or the right place to put the nail. And I think there's a way that when I finish a book, it's just an intuition. It's just, I know that I don't have anything more to say on that subject. It's like I just let it sit. And I'm fascinated, Anna, that you let your book sit for so long after it was finished, because I think that's, for me, the key too. I've never let it sit for 13 years, but I just think that thing of just letting it sit, and it's almost like you stop itching. So that's my answer to that. And the second question was, is there a character that haunts you? And I feel like for me in this in the news from Spain, I described very briefly that story I wrote about the dancer with the young caretaker. And that pairing, those two people in that apartment alone, and particularly that character, it just doesn't go away. And it's funny, I remember one of my favorite writers, this is an aside, but I love these lists that they asked us to do of the top 10 books. You know, that you've all got them on the table, and I feel like there are 40 amazing books on these lists. I think it's fascinating that there's no overlap on any of our lists, and yet all of you have books on your list that I love too, you know, and it's just very exciting. But I was going to say one of my favorite writers that I didn't put on my list, but I could have, is Catherine Mansfield. And she talks at one point, one of my favorite stories of hers, she has a story called Prelude, and then she has another story called At the Bay that's about the same characters. And she talks about how when she finished, she said, these things wouldn't die down. And I know that feeling. It's like, you know you're done, but it won't die down. And it's interesting that I think some writers go back and write more about those people. And I don't know whether I ever would, but I definitely know that feeling of it's done, but it won't die down.
So when I knew it was done, you could argue that your book is never really done. You could always do something more. Even, here it is all printed up and everything, and it's like, oh, why didn't I change that? But eventually you have to let it go, and you have to give it to someone who tells you it's done. And usually that's your editor at a publishing house, which is the way it was for me. But it's hard to let it go, because you could tinker forever, but you have to want to let go. You have to just put your kindergartner on the bus and say bye and give him a little kiss. As for a character, that is such a good question, and I've been asked a lot of questions since this book was published, and no one has ever asked that one. And you really made me sit and have to think about that. And the character, aside from the main character, who's very near and dear to my heart, thinking about the other characters, there is one, Nessa, who is this street girl who has been through so much. She's 14, she turns 15. And she's such a survivor, and she also has an ability to maintain her innocence. Even though she's been through so much, she still is good and pure and strong. And the more I think about it, since you asked that question, the more I'm thinking, gee, maybe I should write an offshoot book about that one character and what got her to that place, and then what happens later. So that was really interesting. So thank you for that insight.
Yes, I'd like to second the comment about the never done idea, because it's very hard for me anyway to let go of some of these things. And the same sort of thing, it doesn't matter if it's in print, it doesn't matter what. If you look at it again, there's always, for me, something you could do with it. And somebody said about the book ending, I actually spent a kind of an absurd amount of time on the last 4, 5, 6 paragraphs of this book. I had to sort of go through this process to convince myself that this was the end of the book, I think. And as far as the favorite character goes, for me in this book, strangely enough, he's not necessarily the most sympathetic character, but for me, the Johann Richter, the former German military officer, is the key figure for me personally, because I think partly because when I first wrote the book out of film school, I really wrote his book. I really wrote his story. And it wasn't until I went back after Schindler's List that I added a whole other dimension to the story. And Michael Cohen, all the rest of it. So I still have a personal attachment to Joan Richter that maybe I don't have to the other characters for whatever reason.
Probably because I have held Hattie for so long in my life, I think that in one way or another the character will be with me always. Sometimes when I'm getting ready for a event like this, or I'll almost like look to Hattie for advice, which way to be, what chapters maybe, what selections to read. But one of the things now I'm finding from readers is that many readers are, and it's wonderful to hear from readers, by the way, so if any of you get around to reading Hattie, I would love to hear your impressions. Send me an email or call me, because I really do enjoy talking with readers about my book. But one of the things readers are saying is, I'm finished with the book and Hattie's still with me. Like, so this is something, this character in a way has an extended life, and she seems to be embraced by the readers, and also to embrace readers in a way that she does have a tendency to stay with you, so.
All right, thank you. Any other questions? Yes.
I wonder, is there a point in going specifically with the state, between the town and the state, that how do you recommend from specific places?
I do. There actually was a reason, and the main one, because I know where it takes place and the time frame, but because of the kinds of issues that Hattie addresses, there's a lot of intensity. There are domestic issues, there's violence issues, there's loss and grief, and I think for us as human beings, we have a tendency to distance ourselves from things or to deny that things can happen. And I think that had I been specific as to time and place, it might give some readers the opportunity to say, oh, well, it happened then, but it doesn't happen now, or, and she speaks to such universal issues that my work with survivors over the years taught me how denial can come into play, and so I wanted to reduce any chance of that if it was to happen.
Oh, one more question, and then we'll move on to some signings. Yes, hi, Bernadette.
Anna, you were talking about connecting with your readers, and I'm wondering briefly, if everybody on the panel can talk about what vehicles have been the best way for each of you to connect with readers and bring in to reading.
For me, I have found that doing readings, and being in front of an audience always creates an opportunity to connect with readers, but also I do Facebook, and I have a Hattie the Novel page, and I find that that's where oftentimes readers, people that I don't even know, will make comments or comment on something that I have posted. I also have a website, and people can send me emails through that. And I'm not shy in a way that I will be in a place. The other day when I was in New York on a subway, and there was a woman sitting next to me, and she was reading on a Nook, and she had the right color on, it was purple, and her energy felt good, and something just said, she's a reader, talk to her about Hattie. And so, I gave her a card, and I said, it looks like you enjoy reading, and this is a book that I wrote, and if you, check it out on the website, because the website will provide an excerpt. It's not like saying you have to go into the bookstore and buy my book right away, but it's an introduction. And so that's what I do. Take any opportunity I can to generate a conversation.
Smart.
I'm actually not a very good authority on this, because I don't have a website, and I'm a very half-hearted Facebook person on there, name only kind of. I actually look to Suzanne and Tommy as my role models for marketing books and connecting with readers, because she'd have to tell yourself, I guess, but they covered every base as far as I can tell, for getting books out there, for letting feedback come in, and it's great to do. But I'm gonna give you better experts on that.
Well, I had to really learn a lot about social media that I didn't know. I like Facebook and being in contact with my friends, but in using social media to get the word out about my book, I had to learn a lot. And these two people, my husband and my daughter, we call them CMT, Cal's marketing team. I couldn't have done it without them, because my daughter, being a youngster in her 20s, she knows from social media, and so she actually helps me with Twitter, and I have a new Facebook page. I have a website. I was on a blog tour. I didn't even know what a blog tour was, so I visited all these independent blogs where people wrote about books, about young adult books, and some of these have thousands of followers, and so that helped get the word out. And then people say that they liked it, and then another person will respond, oh yeah, I've heard about that book. And so word gets out. And Goodreads, I have a presence on Goodreads, which is another thing online. And outside of social media, which I really felt like was a necessary evil in this day and age, and especially because my main audience is young adults, and they spend a lot of time on social media. But also, I have been really loving going into the schools and getting to see kids directly. And there's a kid parent teacher book club that I went to that they had read my book, which was fabulous. I'd go to any book club because I just love to talk about my book with people who have, especially if people who have enjoyed it. So, but yeah, so that's basically, but the publisher does send me to some things. And this summer I'm going to the ALA, American Library Association, in Chicago, and I was chosen to be part on a game show, the authors versus the librarians. I'm one of the authors. I'm one of the authors, and we're going to be playing Family Feud. And so I'm one of the what do they call them? The fearless authors versus the spark plug librarians or something like that. So that's going to be a good way just to be visible in front of librarians and people who love books. So just being out there, I guess.
Yeah, and I also have I have a Facebook page that's an author page, so it's something where I can publicize what I'm doing and publicize events and things like that. And so that's one thing that I'm still sort of a little bit klutzy about, but I have it. The website has been actually wonderful because I do get a lot of letters through the website, and that's really exciting and moving. And with the suicide books, I get letters from writers, which is really exciting, people who have read the book and loved it as a piece of writing. But I also get letters from people who have had their own experience with suicide in their family and found something in the book that resonated with them. And often people will tell me their own stories. And again, I find that really, really moving, and I get it. I think there's something about telling the story that's really important. So that's been great. And then also, I also have found book groups to be a really lovely way to sort of talk about the book, hear what people think about the book, and almost to gossip about the book. I think it's very interesting to me, that question about letting go of your characters. When you live with characters over a period of years, they start to seem like real people to you, and it's very exciting to go to a book group because people in the book group have spent time with your book and they think those people are real too. So it's kind of like you're in there and you're gossiping about these people that have never existed, but it's fascinating. It's really frank, and it's loving, even when it's kind of like, why did she do that? I like that. I like being in a group where you're accepting something that's not true as real. I think that's exciting. And I also think one thing that has also been taught to me by getting letters from readers, it's made me realize that, writing is a very private experience. You're just kind of alone. I'm usually home in my nightgown at my kitchen table. It's very private. Reading is a private experience. But then this interaction between a reader and a writer it's like you're coming out into the open. And I am so grateful when people write me letters, and it makes me realize that when I read a book that I love, it's really worth the time to write to the writer, because writers are lonely, and it's just really nice to know that someone's out there loving your book. I have so many books where I finish them, I'm in tears, I just adore the book, I adore the writer, and then I just fold it up and I put it away in the bookshelf, and it would never occur to me to write and say I loved your book. So, but it's now that I know how nice it is to get that letter, I'm actually trying to write more of those letters myself.
One of the things I'd like to add to all that, when somebody shares with you about the character, I was recently a guest at a book club, and throughout the discussion, there was about 12 women there, and I was thrilled because they said it was the best book club they ever had, that they never discussed the character as much. But I learned things about my character that I didn't know. It's like readers will pick up on something and point something out, and I'd be like, oh my gosh, I didn't realize that. And so it opens up this whole other avenue of you getting to know your character in a way that, because I was so close to her, maybe I didn't see other perspectives. So that's really a lovely thing that happens.
I'd like to just second one thing Joan said, because from the other angle, it wasn't people coming to me particularly, but in researching my novel and in getting some feedback from one aspect or another and showing it to writers, I contacted out of the blue some pretty well-known writers, World War II writers, guys I really didn't know at all, and they have all been very responsive. And I don't know if it's because they're lonely or what, but you might keep that in mind. It's surprising what you can get back from authors, even if you think, oh my gosh, this person is selling millions of books and whatever. You give it a try if you feel like it.
Well, there are 4 authors today who are not lonely. So thank you for keeping them company.
Not today.
Thank you for everything. This is just wonderful. We have more lovely food. Help yourself. Scope out the books. Come out and chat with our authors or have your book signed. Ask another question. We'll be here for a little bit longer. Thank you so much for coming today again. Enjoy and happy reading.